Hello guys, it's me again, Ammar, and I'm back with another video. In this video I'm gonna test the 1080 Ti that I previously owned versus the 3080 that I recently purchased for around 350 USD, used basically. So basically the 1080 Ti is on water and using an XOC vBIOS and overclocked to 2100 MHz on the core clocks, and on memory clocks it's clocked to 6400 MHz, while the 3080 is clocked at 1920 MHz at 900 millivolt, which is an undervolt profile that I did for this card. And I did a plus 500 on the memory clocks on the 3080. So yeah, I did tested it at 1440p and at 4K resolutions. And one more thing, the testing that I did for the 1080 Ti benchmarks, my memory clocks was at 3800 MHz CL 14, 14, 14, 28, 52. While the 3080 is using 3600 MHz CL 14. Because the motherboard BIOS, I had to update the motherboard BIOS and now it doesn't want to boot at 3800 MHz CL14 basically. So yeah, I left it at 3600 CL14 with tight timings. And before we jump into the video, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and let's jump into it. In TimeSpy Extreme GPU test, we can see that the 3080 is winning by a fair bit margin, from 5137 on the 1080 Ti to 8844 on the 3080. On Firestrike Extreme GPU test, we can see that the 3080 is pushing 21106 points versus the 15596 points for the overclocked 1080 Ti with the XOC vBIOS. Basically no power limit, no temperature limit on the 1080 Ti. Alright, in Red Dead Redemption 2 at 1440p, the 1080 Ti is averaging at 45 FPS, while the 3080 is averaging at a whopping 101 FPS, while the 1% low on the 1080 Ti is at 36 FPS and 3080 at 74 FPS on the 1% low. And at 4K, the 1080 Ti, even when overclocked to the max, is barely holding 30 FPS, while the 3080 is still pushing above 60 FPS. Days Gone at 1440p. Both cards did very well, but the 3080 is holding the lead by 37 FPS on average and an acceptable 1% low. While at 4K, the 1080 Ti is barely hitting 52 FPS, while the 3080 is comfortably holding 82 FPS on average. In Cyberpunk 2077, at 1440p high preset, no FSR, no any upscale techniques, only rasterization. The 1080 Ti is holding above 60 FPS on average, while the 3080 is holding 84 FPS. At 4K, the 1080 Ti was basically a slideshow at 23 FPS, while the 3080 was barely hitting 47 FPS on average. Keep in mind that when driving around the towns, the FPS will vary. In Dying Light 2 at 1440p high settings, we can see that the 1080 Ti is almost hitting the 60 FPS mark, while the 3080 is holding 101 FPS very comfortably. But at 4K, the 1080 Ti is hitting the 30 FPS mark, and 3080 is basically hitting 60 FPS on average. In Horizon Zero Dawn at 1440p max settings, both cards are providing a very good experience. 74 FPS average on the 1080 Ti and 119 on 3080, while the 1% low basically is pretty good on both cards in my opinion. At 4K, we can see that the 1080 Ti is hitting 44 on average and 39 on 1% low, while the 3080 is comfortably sitting at 73 FPS on average and 64 on 1% low. And finally, we look at the max power draw on both cards. Keep in mind that I was running hardware info in the background while doing these tests. So basically, the 1080 Ti is using way more power, around 427 watts, due to the unlocked power limit thanks to the XOC vBIOS. And the max peak I saw on this 3080 was 340 watts basically. Alright guys, so I'm back after the benchmarks. Basically, the performance jump from 1080 Ti to the 3080 is quite good, in my opinion, especially for the price that I paid. Like, I paid like around 350 to 360 USD, and I installed a water block on it and stuff like that, so it's going to be around 450 USD total. So yeah, all in all, a jump from a 1080 Ti to a 3080 is quite a healthy bump in performance overall. So yeah, that will conclude the video. If you like this video, please hit the like button, consider subscribing to the channel, and I'll see you on the next one.